What if the fate of entire armies rested not on numbers, but on a single, calculated decision? Discover how British strategy quietly outwitted opponents and changed the course of history forever. Even the largest armies can be undone by a single, carefully considered decision. From the earliest days of Britain's military history, strategy was never simply a matter of numbers or brute force. It was a deliberate, disciplined exercise in anticipation, understanding, and foresight. Commanders were trained to see the battlefield not as a chaotic space of chance, but as a carefully constructed environment where each decision rippled outward, influencing outcomes in ways both immediate and unforeseen. This mindset was cultivated over decades, shaped by experience, study, and reflection, and it formed the foundation upon which British strategic brilliance would later stand. Every choice made, from the placement of troops to the timing of reinforcements, was considered not only for its immediate effect, but for the cascading consequences it would produce. The intellectual rigor behind such planning instilled a confidence among commanders and a quiet assurance among the soldiers who trusted that their leaders could foresee dangers before they became threats. These early lessons were often learned in smaller conflicts, in colonial campaigns or European skirmishes, where the stakes were significant enough to demand attention, but small enough to allow experimentation. Through these engagements, British officers internalized the value of patience, reconnaissance, and the subtle interplay between visible maneuvers and hidden intentions. Integral to this approach was the meticulous study of previous battles. Commanders pored over records, analyzed failures, and identified patterns that could be applied to future encounters. Success in one engagement rarely led to complacency. It served as a reminder that victory was fragile and required constant intellectual effort to maintain. This culture of careful study was paired with an institutional structure that reinforced strategic thinking. Staff officers were encouraged to question, to debate, and to consider alternatives in a way that strengthened the final decisions taken by those in command. Decision-making was rarely rushed, and a premium was placed on information, accurate, timely, and relevant, to allow leaders to weigh options against the possible reactions of an opponent. Over time, this practice became second nature, and it cultivated a military philosophy that valued foresight as highly as courage or strength. The psychological effect on the soldiers themselves was subtle but significant. They moved with a quiet confidence, aware that their actions were not arbitrary, that each maneuver was part of a greater, coherent plan, and that even in the midst of apparent danger, a higher-order logic guided the unfolding of events. British strategic thinking also emphasized flexibility. While careful planning was crucial, the ability to adapt to unexpected developments distinguished successful commanders from the merely competent. They learned to read not only the movements of enemy forces, but the temperament of opposing leaders, anticipating reactions and exploiting hesitation. Training instilled a sense of situational awareness, an understanding that the battlefield was an evolving puzzle to be interpreted in real time. This meant cultivating an acute awareness of terrain, supply lines, communication, and morale. The integration of these elements allowed commanders to orchestrate complex operations that could outmaneuver opponents far larger or seemingly stronger. Importantly, this mindset cultivated an appreciation for patience and timing. Waiting for the precise moment to act, even when it seemed counterintuitive, often produced results far greater than immediate, forceful action. It was this combination of meticulous preparation, historical awareness, and adaptive intelligence that made British strategic decisions so effective and so difficult for enemies to counter. Audiences listening to this account gain insight into a form of leadership that prizes thoughtfulness over aggression, foresight over impulsivity. The intention is not merely to recount events, but to convey the quiet power of disciplined, deliberate decision-making. By focusing on the mental frameworks, the habits of study, and the cultivated instincts that guided British commanders, the listener is invited to appreciate the depth of strategic mastery that underpinned later battlefield successes. There is a sense of calm authority in understanding that these victories were rarely the result of luck, but of patient, intelligent orchestration. This perspective encourages the listener to reflect on the value of measured judgment, the interplay of preparation and intuition, and the weight of responsibility carried by those making decisions that would shape the fates of thousands. Even the positioning of a single unit or the timing of a message could influence the outcome of an entire engagement. Understanding these subtleties provides insight not just into military history, but into the broader principles of leadership, planning, and consequence. As the narrative of British strategy unfolds, it becomes clear that the true power of these commanders lay not in overwhelming force, but in their ability to see the invisible lines connecting decisions to outcomes and to act with the patience, clarity, and precision necessary to exploit them fully. The quiet calculations of these commanders would soon collide with the unpredictable chaos of battle, revealing just how far foresight could extend influence. A whispered message, a subtle misstep, or a carefully planted rumor could change the course of a battle before a sword was ever drawn. British military success was never the result of sheer numbers alone. It was built upon an intricate web of intelligence and deception that allowed commanders to shape the battlefield long before armies engaged. From the careful collection of information on enemy positions to the deliberate dissemination of misleading reports, strategy extended beyond the obvious maneuvers of soldiers and cannons. Reconnaissance units moved quietly, observing movements, terrain, and supply lines, while operatives in the field gathered insights that could prove decisive. Officers learned to value accuracy over speed, understanding that a single verified detail could outweigh a week of uncertain reports. This attention to intelligence fostered an environment where decisions were informed and calculated rather than reactive, giving commanders the ability to anticipate enemy behavior with remarkable precision. The subtlety of such operations meant that often the enemy would act against itself, misled by the very information intended to manipulate their expectations. Deception played a central role in this strategic philosophy. British forces became adept at creating false impressions, visible troop movements designed to suggest an attack in one location, while preparations unfolded elsewhere, feigned retreats, and controlled leaks of information. The goal was not to dazzle, but to shape perception, exploiting the human tendency to respond predictably under pressure. Commanders understood that misjudgment by the enemy could yield disproportionate advantage, allowing a smaller force to achieve an outsized impact. Every falsified report, every subtle ruse, was calculated to provoke a specific reaction, and the discipline required to maintain the illusion was immense. These methods demanded patience, careful timing, and an understanding of the opponent's expectations and fears. The success of deception rested as much on restraint as on execution, and the most skilled officers were those who could withhold action until the precise moment when it would achieve maximum effect. The psychological dimension of intelligence operations extended to morale as well. Soldiers were often kept unaware of the broader maneuvers around them, fostering focus on immediate duties while the command structure orchestrated wider outcomes. Meanwhile, adversaries were manipulated into miscalculating strength, overextending resources, or abandoning advantageous positions. This quiet orchestration relied on the intellectual agility of leaders who could interpret partial information, anticipate missteps, and react fluidly to unforeseen developments. Listening to these accounts, the audience begins to understand that the outcome of battles was shaped as much by what was hidden as by what was visible, and that perception could be as critical as force. Intelligence and deception were not ancillary to strategy. They were the backbone of operational superiority, subtly tipping the scales in favor of the British without overt confrontation. Commanders also emphasized redundancy and verification. Multiple sources were cross-checked, ensuring that plans were based on reality rather than assumption. This methodical approach reduced error and increased confidence in decision-making. At the same time, leaders considered how their own forces might be perceived by the enemy, deliberately shaping visibility and information flow. Even the timing of signals, the spacing of units, and the cadence of movements were designed to communicate specific impressions. By controlling information, British commanders could manipulate the tempo of battle, making opponents hesitate, misjudge, or respond inappropriately. The elegance of this approach lay in its indirectness. Victory was achieved not by brute force alone, but by guiding others to act in ways that facilitated success. For the listener, this section emphasizes the intellectual dimension of warfare, the mental discipline required to anticipate and influence. It cultivates a sense of quiet admiration for strategic subtlety, showing that victory often began long before armies clashed. The audience is invited to recognize the weight of foresight, the importance of patience, and the skill required to shape events without direct engagement. Understanding these layers encourages reflection on the nature of leadership, decision-making, and human behavior under pressure. The delicate interplay of observation, prediction, and manipulation created a battlefield in which opponents frequently acted against their own interests, and in doing so, demonstrated the power of measured, intelligent control. The careful orchestration of information would soon meet the reality of maneuvering armies, where anticipation and deception collided with terrain and timing. Captain Way assessed, a battle is often won not at the point of a sword, but in the spaces between, where movement and timing dictate the outcome. British commanders understood that positioning and maneuvering were as decisive as combat itself. The careful orchestration of troop movements, the exploitation of terrain, and the anticipation of enemy reactions combined to form a silent yet powerful mechanism of control on the battlefield. Every hill, river, and ridge was studied not simply for immediate advantage, but for the long-term implications it held over lines of retreat, reinforcement, and supply. Commanders learned to perceive the battlefield as a living map of possibilities, where each adjustment could alter the dynamics of engagement. Units were positioned with deliberate foresight, creating flexibility for both defense and offense, while simultaneously limiting the enemy's options. This understanding of maneuvering required patience, discipline, and a keen eye for detail, ensuring that soldiers acted in harmony with a broader strategic vision that remained largely invisible to those watching casually. The British approach emphasized anticipation over reaction. Leaders trained to foresee potential threats, to recognize patterns in enemy behavior, and to exploit those patterns with minimal risk to their forces. Troop deployments were staggered, creating overlapping fields of coverage while maintaining mobility. Flanking maneuvers were calculated with precise attention to timing and distance, ensuring that when an attack was launched, it struck at a moment of maximal vulnerability. The careful sequencing of reinforcements and reserves allowed commanders to respond dynamically to unexpected developments, transforming uncertainty into an advantage. This method relied heavily on the discipline and training of the soldiers, who had to maintain composure and follow orders without immediate feedback or visible signs of progress. The trust between leadership and the ranks was implicit, built upon confidence in planning, experience, and a shared understanding of objectives. Terrain was manipulated as a strategic asset. Natural obstacles could channel enemy forces into predictable paths, creating opportunities for concentrated defense or decisive counterattacks. Rivers, forests, and hills were not passive features, but active elements of a commander's toolkit, requiring detailed knowledge and careful observation. Supply lines were laid with foresight, ensuring that units could move efficiently while maintaining readiness for sudden changes in engagement. Even small adjustments, shifting a battalion a few hundred meters or altering the timing of a march, could generate cascading effects, allowing smaller forces to outmaneuver larger ones or turn an apparent disadvantage into an opportunity. This emphasis on precision and spatial awareness created battles in which outcomes were determined as much by planning and positioning as by the confrontation of arms. The orchestration of maneuver also relied on subtle communication. Signals, messengers, and prearranged instructions allowed commands to be executed even under the pressure of unfolding events. Coordination ensured that multiple elements of an army acted cohesively, creating the appearance of unity and control even in the midst of apparent chaos. By controlling the rhythm and timing of movements, British commanders could influence the psychological state of opposing forces, inducing hesitation, confusion, or overextension. The interaction of movement, timing, and perception became a central tenet of strategy, demonstrating that intellectual control over the battlefield could rival physical dominance in determining outcomes. For the listener, This section emphasizes the intellectual craftsmanship behind military maneuvers. The narrative cultivates a sense of thoughtful observation, encouraging reflection on the patience, foresight, and discipline required to orchestrate complex operations. The audience gains an appreciation for the subtle power of movement, timing, and spatial awareness, understanding that success on the battlefield often depended on quiet, deliberate choices made far from immediate combat. By presenting maneuver as both an art and a science, the story invites listeners to engage with strategy at a conceptual level, fostering insight into the principles that guided British military thinking. The integration of precise positioning, coordinated movement, and adaptive response transformed the battlefield into a controlled environment where advantage was created through intellect and preparation rather than sheer force. These calculated maneuvers set the stage for encounters where careful planning and timing would decide the fate of entire armies. SS. Victory is often measured not by the size of an army, but by the clarity of the choices made in its command. In the decisive engagements where British strategy truly revealed its strength, the combination of preparation, anticipation, and maneuver coalesced into outcomes that seemed almost inevitable in hindsight. Commanders approached these battles not with a sense of brute force, but with a careful orchestration of every available resource, understanding that even minor decisions could ripple across the battlefield with profound consequences. Troop dispositions were arranged to maximize flexibility and resilience, allowing for rapid adaptation to the unpredictable behavior of opponents. This careful planning extended to logistics, reserves, and communication, ensuring that forces remained coordinated and responsive throughout the engagement. Rather than overwhelming the enemy with sheer numbers, British leaders sought to create situations where the opponent's mistakes became unavoidable, where errors in judgment or miscalculations could be turned decisively to advantage. Every movement, every signal, and every deployment was calculated to maintain the initiative, to guide the enemy toward outcomes predetermined by strategy rather than chance. Understanding the psychology of opposing commanders was as important as knowing terrain or troop strength. British officers studied their adversaries' tendencies, predicting how they would react under pressure and shaping engagements to exploit predictable patterns. Feints, diversions, and controlled withdrawals were employed not to conceal weakness, but to provoke overconfidence or missteps. The ability to manipulate the expectations and responses of the enemy transformed confrontations into exercises in foresight, where advantage was gained before the first shot was fired. Timing became a critical factor. The precise moment to commit reserves, to execute flanking attacks, or to shift formations could tip the balance decisively. Soldiers, trained to follow instructions with discipline, executed these maneuvers with a confidence born of understanding that each action was part of a broader, coherent plan. This trust between leadership and troops was foundational, allowing complex operations to unfold without confusion or hesitation. In these engagements, terrain continued to play a decisive role. British commanders exploited natural features to channel opposing forces into disadvantageous positions, creating opportunities for concentrated fire, enfilade attacks, or tactical encirclement. Hills, ridges, and natural barriers became tools in a larger cognitive strategy, shaping the battlefield in subtle but decisive ways. Similarly, supply lines and lines of retreat were carefully managed to prevent disruption, allowing forces to maintain momentum and readiness throughout the engagement. By controlling not only their own forces, but also influencing the movement and perception of the enemy, commanders transformed battles into controlled experiments, where outcomes reflected strategic foresight as much as martial skill. These decisive engagements also demonstrated the interplay between initiative and patience. Leaders refrained from acting prematurely, instead observing the development of enemy movements and waiting for the moment when their strategy could be fully realized. Reserves were held back until they could have maximum impact, feints were maintained until the opponent committed to a miscalculated course, and timing was coordinated with such precision that the unfolding battle appeared both natural and inevitable. This deliberate pacing reinforced a psychological advantage, keeping adversaries off balance and creating opportunities for decisive maneuvers that magnified the effectiveness of the British forces. For the listener, these examples convey a sense of intellectual mastery over the battlefield. The emphasis is not on the spectacle of combat, but on the reasoning, anticipation, and disciplined execution that defined success. The audience is encouraged to reflect on how foresight, observation, and careful orchestration can influence outcomes in complex situations, highlighting leadership qualities that extend beyond the military sphere. By presenting these engagements as studies in decision-making under uncertainty, the narrative maintains a calm, immersive rhythm, ensuring engagement while offering insight into strategic thinking. Through these carefully managed confrontations, British forces consistently turned potential disadvantage into decisive advantage, illustrating the enduring value of strategy over sheer force. As the immediate victories unfolded, the broader consequences of these choices began to ripple far beyond the battlefield itself. The echoes of a battle often extend far beyond the clash of weapons, shaping politics, societies, and the course of history itself. The outcomes of British strategic victories were never confined to the battlefield. Each engagement produced consequences that resonated across the political and social landscape, influencing alliances, territorial control, and the broader balance of power. Commanders were acutely aware that their decisions carried weight far beyond the immediate conflict, and this awareness shaped every maneuver, every deployment, and every calculated risk. A victory achieved through careful planning not only secured territory, but also reinforced credibility, projecting power in a manner that dissuaded potential adversaries from future confrontation. Conversely, a miscalculation could weaken influence, strain resources, and invite challenges from opportunistic opponents. This understanding imbued British strategy with a dual purpose: to win battles and to shape the wider geopolitical context in which those battles occurred, ensuring that tactical success translated into enduring advantage. The careful management of consequences extended to diplomatic and economic considerations. Military operations were coordinated with political objectives, allowing victories to support treaties, reinforce claims, and establish favorable conditions for negotiation. Commanders understood that control of key locations, access to resources, and the demonstration of disciplined capability could influence the decisions of neutral states or allies, creating ripple effects that amplified the impact of each engagement. This strategic thinking emphasized foresight not only on the battlefield, but also in anticipating reactions from a broader network of actors. By shaping perceptions, British leaders ensured that victories fostered confidence at home, deterred aggression abroad, and secured long-term benefits that went well beyond immediate military gain. Societal impact was equally significant. The conduct of troops, the treatment of occupied areas, and the efficiency of supply and logistics contributed to public perception and morale. Successes that demonstrated discipline and strategic clarity reinforced national pride, while missteps could undermine confidence in leadership. These considerations informed operational planning, as commanders sought to achieve outcomes that were politically, socially, and morally sustainable. Every decision was measured not only for its tactical value, but for its broader implications, reflecting an understanding that military action was inseparable from the wider human and institutional environment. The ripple effects of decisive strategy also shaped the evolution of military doctrine. Observers and opponents alike studied British campaigns, adopting, adapting, or countering the techniques they encountered. Knowledge gained from careful observation of maneuver, intelligence, and engagement informed subsequent planning, creating a cycle of learning that extended across generations. The audience begins to understand that strategy was a living discipline, continuously refined through experience, reflection, and adaptation, and that the lessons learned on one battlefield could influence conduct in theaters far removed in time and geography. For the listener, this section emphasizes the broader significance of strategy, highlighting the interconnectedness of battlefield action, politics, and society. It cultivates a reflective understanding of history, encouraging the audience to consider how decisions made in moments of conflict resonate beyond the immediate context. The calm, measured narration allows listeners to absorb the weight of consequence without feeling rushed, fostering insight into the thoughtful, deliberate mindset of British commanders. There is a sense of quiet admiration for the ability to navigate complexity, anticipate repercussions, and shape outcomes with subtle intelligence. Through careful orchestration, British victories became instruments of influence, extending the reach of their strategic vision across territories, alliances, and generations. The audience experiences not just the mechanics of victory, but the profound responsibility inherent in leadership, the careful balancing of immediate objectives with long-term ramifications, and the enduring power of foresight applied consistently over time. As the consequences of these campaigns unfolded, the principles of strategic mastery were cemented, influencing both contemporaries and future generations of commanders. The true measure of strategy is not in a single victory, but in the legacy it leaves behind. British military strategy left a mark that extended far beyond the immediate outcomes of any single engagement. The principles developed and refined over centuries: foresight, flexibility, anticipation, and careful orchestration shaped not only contemporary campaigns, but also the evolution of military thought across the globe. Commanders cultivated a deep understanding of how decisions could reverberate through time, influencing future conflicts, shaping alliances, and redefining the parameters of operational planning. This legacy was not merely theoretical, it manifested in the careful training of officers, the meticulous documentation of campaigns, and the adoption of strategic innovations by armies far beyond Britain's shores. Observers and adversaries alike were compelled to acknowledge the quiet yet formidable intelligence that underpinned British operations, recognizing that success often lay less in sheer numbers than in disciplined reasoning and calculated foresight. The enduring influence of British strategy can be seen in the way later military thinkers studied and adapted its principles. Concepts of maneuver, deception, and integration of intelligence became central to doctrine in other nations, and the emphasis on patience and timing informed approaches to engagement across varied theaters of war. Leaders learned to value observation and anticipation, understanding that victory often depended on exploiting patterns, recognizing human tendencies, and orchestrating resources with precision. The approach emphasized the interdependence of all elements of an army, from logistics to morale, demonstrating that strategic success was a synthesis of intellect, discipline, and leadership rather than brute force alone. The audience is invited to reflect on how such careful, deliberate thought created a template for enduring military excellence, illustrating the timeless value of measured decision-making. This legacy also encompasses the cultural and institutional embedding of strategy. Training programs, staff colleges, and military treatises preserved and transmitted knowledge, ensuring that successive generations of commanders internalized the lessons of the past. The narrative of British strategic success was not romanticized. It was treated as a matter of disciplined study and practical application, emphasizing clarity, analysis, and a careful weighing of consequences. Soldiers and officers alike were immersed in a tradition that prized reasoning and foresight, cultivating minds capable of understanding complexity and executing plans with precision. For listeners, this demonstrates the power of systematic thought and the influence of deliberate institutional culture in shaping human behavior and historical outcomes. The enduring impact of these strategies extended to broader historical developments. British victories influenced political alignments, trade, and colonial administration, creating a framework in which strategic thinking extended beyond the battlefield into governance, diplomacy, and societal organization. By understanding the principles that guided these decisions, listeners gain insight into how thoughtful, informed action can ripple across domains, shaping societies and institutions over decades and even centuries. The cumulative effect of this disciplined approach illustrates the profound capacity of strategy to shape history, not merely through single engagements, but through sustained application of intellect, planning, and foresight. Listeners are encouraged to appreciate the subtlety and depth of this influence. The narrative fosters calm reflection, illustrating that leadership and strategy are continuous exercises in anticipation, assessment, and measured action. The story invites a sense of awe, not through spectacle, but through the recognition of skill, patience, and enduring insight applied consistently over time. By considering the legacy of British strategy, the audience experiences the full arc of historical consequence, understanding that victories are only meaningful when they inform future decisions, shape practices, and leave lasting lessons. Through foresight, calculation, and adaptability, British commanders forged a legacy that shaped military thought for generations. The principles they honed, the decisions they executed, and the foresight they demonstrated collectively stand as a testament to the enduring power of strategic intelligence. Listeners are left with a clear sense of the scope and subtlety of this mastery, appreciating not only the victories themselves, but the thoughtful processes and lasting influence that made them possible.